Okay, it's 2 o'clock. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Sean Conrad with the Sustainable Development team here at MCT COG. And also from Sustainable Development here, we have Travis Liska. Hello, Travis. And we have Sydney Steelman also joining us. I'd like to welcome everyone to our third meeting of the Coordinated Land Use and Transportation Task Force, the fourth meeting. Thank you all for joining us again. We developed the task force as a forum for the Texas local governments to discuss best practices related to coordinating land use and transportation plans, policies, and progress. So we hope today's discussion is useful for you. We are recording this meeting, and the recording will be posted on our website along with the presentations and a meeting summary next week. If you have any questions or comments at any time, feel free to enter those into the chat box. We'll have a few minutes after each presentation to take any questions you have related to that presentation. And then we'll also have some time for any other questions and general discussion at the end after all of the presentations are done. Okay, so we have, in a second, I'm getting a little bit of a delay on my end in advancing slides. Here we go. Our upcoming meetings are in July and October of, it should be 2021. So mark those on your calendars, and we also have our calendar on the website. Today's meeting, we have local updates that we'll be starting out with from Dart and downtown Corinth. And then we'll move into presentations around our theme today, which is infill development and transportation. And then we'll, again, of course, wrap up with some time for overall questions, discussion, and announcements. For our local updates, we'll be hearing from Jack Rosinski from he's the Director of Economic Development at Dart. He'll be talking about their development of TOD typologies, and we'll also hear from Bob Hart, who's the city manager with the city of Corinth, about a new DCTA A train stop and their TOD plans. So I'll go ahead and pass it now on to Jack.
Okay, let's just go to the third page, next two. Let's skip over these next two. Okay. A little background, many of you that have been around for a while may know, DART has had TOD guidelines back since 2008. We first did it. The guidelines back then were really done more to respond to developer inquiries. Back then, TOD was a fairly new concept. And generally that's what it was concepts, but nothing really on the ground, except for the two we always pointed at was Mockingbird Station and Southside on Lamar. So what we did is develop those to respond to sort of DART requirements, DART needs, and a little response to what FTA's involvement was. About 3 years ago, we went back and realized that those guidelines were way out of date, and they really weren't serving the purpose that we needed out there. So we've changed the TOD guidelines more now to a more of an educational type of format. It's about 40 pages altogether. And it talks more in terms of the concept of TOD and breaks down the specific elements of it. So generally, I'm going to go through and just hit some of the representative slides. This is available on our DART website, www.dart.org/economic development, or you can go to our website and go to About DART and find TOD through there. But we've got that on our website. That basically everything on the website has been updated within the last year. And this was one of the last things we did, and really got held up a little bit due to COVID, but we got this online back in September. And now it's distributed widely. Next slide. The thing that was done at the same time as this TOD guidelines update, and what's held up the TOD guidelines update, was also an update of the TOD policy. That had been done last in 2015. We had a lot of new issues and ideas pop up, and our board asked to update that. So what we did is midway through the process of updating the guidelines, we updated the TOD policy. And one of the things that's really focused on the policy is in the purpose statement, which you can't see on the slide, it's pretty small. But this is attached to the TOD guidelines also. But it really sort of demonstrates what this is all about. DART seeks to work in close partnership with its service area cities to identify TOD opportunities which reflect service area policies, land use, housing, parking, and other related goals and policies. One of the things that we really wrestled with, which was important to all of our cities, but also as we went through the update, realized all the cities have different goals and policies, and how do we incorporate that into an overall TOD policy, which represents the 13 cities. So what we've done is we've addressed and really, and this is also part of what we found out, even in talking with some of our board members, there's a lack of understanding of sort of what the cities are responsible for, what DART's responsible for. There's even in the public, there's a lot of thought, particularly in the public, that DART is just like a city. We've got the same powers. We can go in and change parking requirements and land uses, all of that, which is about as far from the truth as possible. DART does not even have economic development tools. Next slide. So as we get to the next slide, yeah, here, and this is an important slide. And again, all this is all replicated in the guidelines. But we've really tried to spell out what the roles of each of the individual parties are. What is DART's role, which is providing transit service mobility within our 700 square mile service area. The cities, what their role is, how the developers and property owners play into it, and also the public and advocacy organizations. So how all that works together to implement these TOD guidelines. Next. So next. What we really did is focus on this on some of the issues that were really moving forward in North Texas and particularly the DART service area, looking at emerging markets, promote location efficiency, access to jobs, walkable destinations. All of these have become even more so important post-COVID, but these were things that are being seriously talked about. Increases for safety pedestrians and bicyclists. This is something that was being focused on a couple of years ago, but now we've seen even more so pedestrian and bicycle activity. And so how do we incorporate that in the last mile and station? So all this is incorporated in the guidelines. Next slide. Looking at TOD benefits, another thing we have, and this is online also, is a UNT study. We do this every 3 or 4 years. We update to show what the impact is in the early days of DART. A lot of cities wanted to know exactly what are we getting for that sales tax that DART is getting from us, that 1 cent. How does that have to figure in? And so what we've done is track development throughout the service area over the years, starting in 1999, and monitored it. The last study that we did And this was put out in July. And again, due to COVID, there really wasn't a lot of attention pointed at this. We just got it online and it's been out there and we've mentioned it as much as we could. But this, the last shows that there has now been $16 billion of investment within that quarter-mile area around rail stations. So it's mixed use investment, residential, retail, not as much retail, something we're still looking at to mature in the market, but office, a lot of these elements, and the importance of it is that this is a real result of having that, what we see as connectivity to access to jobs, access to places to live, and entertainment destinations. Next slide. So what we've done is broken this out into the different areas: station area, context, and opportunities. Looking at the dark facilities and property, the station area conditions around them. We've done market assessments based on this, and what the development opportunities around the rail station. We have an inventory of dark properties that could have potential for TOD on our website also. And then also, as part of that, we've also identified first mile, last mile opportunities. And in the market analysis that we've done on all the properties, we also have a walk score related to each of them. Next slide. So what we did is develop typologies for each of the station areas, just to give you an idea. I know some cities have done plans around their stations and developed other typologies. City of Dallas has a set of typologies they developed. This is what we looked at, working with our consultants on sort of a broad typology of all the station areas. So I'm just going to go through these real quickly, as all this is in the guidelines. Next slide. We've identified on a map of all the variation of the typologies and where they're located on the system map. Next slide. And beginning with urban core, which is basically the downtown, the dense environment, urban districts. Next slide. The downtown and town centers. I think if there's one area that we've really seen the benefits of transit-oriented development in the suburban environment are in those small downtowns and town centers. The Rowletts in Garland, Plano, Farmers Branch, which we'll be hearing from here in a little bit from Tina, and Carrollton, really see the impact of these station areas, particularly in those downtowns. And then another typology, community centers. Next slide. Destinations such as the Victory area, maybe convention center, places like that. And then sort of the always famous other, our catch-all for some of the station areas. We have some residential that really will be nothing but local residential station areas. And so we keep that within the other. Next slide. So, and then with that, what we follow into is looking at sort of the typical design. And again, nothing in these guidelines is meant to be, this is the way you have to do it. These are just examples, sort of case studies on good ideas. And if you just want to take one or two ideas from this, that's fine. But really, it's how to incorporate all these elements into creating a unique TOD environment around each of the station areas. Next slide. Looking at development patterns, again, street and pathway networks, how to integrate walking and bicycling into an environment that, from all intents and purposes, is usually heavily automobile oriented, and how to shift that. Next slide. Parking, the always interesting area of TOD is parking. How much is enough and how much is too much? We've referenced the COG study that we all partnered on a couple of years ago. That's referenced here in the guidelines, but really, and what we've looked at in parking utilization is generally DART parking. We park about 45% of all the spaces we have, and this was pre-COVID. A lot less now, but we're planning now to start building back up again. But nonetheless, we are not using our property efficiently when it comes to surface parking areas. So we're working with our member cities on how to develop some of that, if not all the parking lots, and incorporate what parking is needed into shared parking or into parking garages and minimize surface parking. Next slide. So just a couple of bullets from on parking, and there's a lot more to this in the guidelines, but what we really identified, which is I don't think anything new to everybody in this group, is that we're overbuilding our parking, even around TODs, which one of the points of a TOD is to be able to reduce parking. And what we're finding and what the COG study has pointed out is we're still overbuilding parking, and even around TODs, they're parking beyond what their parking requirements are. So it's really something that has to be looked at. City of Dallas is going through this right now and re-examining their parking ordinance. Next slide. Looking at streets and public spaces, again, you'll see this is a common theme throughout the guidelines, and also ride sharing services, kiss and ride. What used to be kiss and ride is being converted into other uses, such as, we've got a couple of stations with Zipcar, and using some of the new technology that is being developed and how to take advantage of that. Next slide. Public spaces, which is always important. These are really, particularly with a TOD, the opportunity to leverage public spaces, gathering places, walkable places is always an advantage, particularly where you've got a lot of public land involved. Next slide. And then site and building design. How do we include the buildings, incorporate buildings and integrate them around the station areas around these public spaces, but be close up, close by, and moving parking garages further away, not closer to. And so that's one of the things that we point out here. One thing we haven't done is gotten into sort of what is the correct density as if there was one. We leave that to the cities. Again, that's the city's role to develop the land use requirements and policies. What we're trying to just point out in the guidelines here are sort of best practices and things that need to be addressed. Next slide. Lastly, and this is the one that was really sort of difficult to deal with, because what we're finding is every city is looking at a different, not looking at a different way, but addressing in their own particular way, depending on what the goals of the city are amongst all their many other goals, trying to incorporate, and how does that fit into transit-oriented development. There's no real one size fits all for this. There are some cities have TOD housing programs, others don't. And so what we really try to do is just reflect sort of best practices, why it's important to look at various types of housing, whether it's affordable, whether it's workforce housing, or just market based housing, and look at it from that perspective. Next slide. And I think this is getting towards the end here, but lastly, what we looked at again, as I mentioned earlier, density and intensity. And I think here the intensity is more important, trying to get that activity on the street, and knowing that, in the early days of TOD, a lot of us focused on trying to get retail. And I think it was sort of our own sort of come to Jesus that you can't force retail into any market. It's sort of the no-brainer, but we proved it out. But I think, how do we build projects that can incorporate as they intensify and as they densify? How do we incorporate some of the other uses, the retail uses, the services and support? And also, how do we incorporate a mix of employment-based as well as residential into these areas, and take advantage of the rail at the same time, as well as the bus system? Because when we talk about last mile, we're also talking about not just walkable to an employment or a residential area, but also what if you live past that sort of 1/2 mile area away? If you live a mile, 2 miles, 5 miles away, what is a convenient way to get you there without having to take your automobile? So anyway, and I think next slide. I think this may be the last slide. Yep. So with that, what I wanted to do with this opportunity that Travis and Sean gave me is just really put out there that we have these guidelines available. They're educational. They're a real good tool, I think, to have in your toolbox when you work with your elected officials, when they come up with the questions of what is this TOD stuff. And because there still is a lot out there that aren't aware of what TOD is, or there's some misinterpretations of what TOD is. So with that, be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jack. Really appreciate that. It's really interesting. If we have maybe a minute, if there's any questions for Jack. Okay, if there's no questions right now, we'll have more time later on for questions and discussion. I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Bob Hart with the City of Corinth.
All right, well, thank you. It's great to be here. But we wanted to just talk a little bit about where we are. We're working with DCTA to look at doing a transit stop here, and we're looking at creating a downtown area, principally between the Corinth City Hall to the Corinth campus of the North Central Texas College. So next slide. Of course, Corinth is up here. We're just outside Denton in the geographical center of Denton County. And next slide. And then this is generally where the rail stop would be. It's just north of Corinth Parkway, and City Hall is there on Corinth Parkway. And so next slide. The way we're trying to finance much of the work here, particularly the TOD component of this, is through a tax increment reinvestment zone that has been created, and the Denton County is a strong participant in that. Next slide. And this is really the TOD area, and it gives you a sense of how we're defining those boundaries. Kind of more or less in the center, that's the North Central Texas College building. And then we're down there kind of a little to the south of that on Corinth Parkway. So next slide. This is a map of the area. We actually had this done by Catalyst with Paris Rutherford, and who was able to lay out a vision of what we wanted to see. And he did that quite well. The idea of doing this came out of a strategic plan that we did with the community about 2 years ago. So this has been a priority for the city council over the past 2 years. So as we're trying to assemble this and so you kind of get a sense of the area where we're focusing. Most of this is vacant currently, so there's very little redevelopment work involved in this. But a lot of it is really centered around making NCTC a larger campus so they can have some expansion opportunities with the TOD. Then they can have a lot more student engagement at the location, and really trying to shuffle students from Denton to Corinth and down to Louisville. So we'd be part of that overall mix. Next slide. This is kind of an aerial view looking back into the area. City Hall is to the right, and NCTC's up in the top left corner. And a lot of the work that we're looking at doing is centered around a park that we're making as the primary public feature within this. And you see the proposed rail stop is there along the tracks. Next slide. And this is a view if you're kind of standing back near the pavilion looking into City Hall. And so these features were obviously real important in helping us to sell the vision and talk about that within the community. Next slide. So this is the same drawing again. It's kind of focused in the area between City Hall and the NCTC campus. We've actually at this point have assembled all of this land. We are working with mixed use development to go in and do a lot of the private development work. The park area that you see there on Corinth Parkway, our council has approved a master plan for that. And we're starting to move forward with the construction documents for that. The street alignments at North Corinth Street, what we call Agora Way, and Main Street that really bounds the park and takes us from Corinth Parkway to Walton is under design now. So the council has awarded a contract for that. And then we're also dealing with the drainage within those areas. And I think then most importantly, obviously, is that we have land we've already acquired the land on both sides of the rail stop. One of the redevelopment components is just on the north side of Walton. We're working with the business to relocate them to another location in Corinth so that NCTC can expand to the south all the way to Walton. And then just a little bit to the east of NCTC, we're actually working with them to acquire some land. And then we'll be doing some single family development up in that area and multifamily. And it's all consistent with the larger plan that you saw a moment ago. So next slide. This is a drawing for the rail stop. We worked with DCTA and LAN engineering to look at the feasibility to make sure this would work. And it does, it works quite well. This is where we have it laid out. And so the way that we've been working with the park feature, that we're doing it so that we can design it back into the rail stop so you can pick up some of the architectural features there. And I think that will enhance the quality of the stop and then the involvement with the public in that area. The one thing that we did find in the study is we had rail crossings at Corinth Parkway and also a double crossing at Walton and North Corinth Street. Those crossings were actually too close to permit the use of a rail stop. And so what we're working on now is closing the two crossings at Walton and North Corinth Street so we can move that north. And then the next slide. And this is a picture of the park you can see it's bounded on all four corners with streets. City Hall is just to the south of it. You can see where the future railroad station would be, just to the west of that. And you begin to see how visually all of that would tie together in the next slide. This is an area, if you're standing on top of City Hall, looking back into the park, this is that feature. So we've got some good treat areas. We'll have a pavilion in there for entertainment. That'll be important for NCTC, but then also obviously for community development. Playground would be a place for that type of public use. And the next slide. And this is the crossing reference that I was making, where we are actually closing the crossings at North Crent Street in Walton and rerouting North Crent Street. But that also then will have to build a crossing a little further north, and that will become the primary access point into the North Central Texas campus. In that way, I think we're really creating some great benefits for them. We're creating an environment that works quite well for the community, and then doing the development around that. And so we appreciated some of Jack's comments, and we picked up some notes from that, but obviously following the practices that have been going on in Dallas County. And so the next slide, I think is, this is kind of a side note on that to help make some of this work. We used to have Clover Leaves coming off I35, and so the 4 shaded areas are properties that TxDOT has as surplus right-of-way, and we have acquired those properties. A little more difficult this past year to do that, but we actually closed on those properties this past Friday. So you can see how those begin to influence some of the development within the TOD area, why it was so important for us to acquire that. And I think there's one, yeah, that's the last slide. So well, this is, and then we have working with Realty Capital that they're doing a mixed use development just to the west side. And again, that's starting to get some value going on within our TOD area, within our tax increment area, that generates some cash to make this work. And I think the most important thing that we've done in this at this point is we've assembled the property that we need. And so the council's been quite willing to do that. And then we're putting in the public infrastructure so we can attract the private investment. And so we're doing that, and concurrently while we're working with DCTA to secure a stop. And with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions. And I suppose we could do that a little later in the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for that update. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I think in the interest of time, we'll move on to our guest speakers, but you can drop any questions or comments in the chat at any time. And also we will, of course, have more time for discussion at the end. Before our guest speakers, I'm going to do a quick introduction to the topic at hand, just to set the stage a little bit. And here we go. Okay. Just going to talk a little bit about infill development and transportation real quick, just a few slides here. You can advance, there we go. So NCT COG actually has a policy in our mobility plan, which is Mobility 2045 for transportation infrastructure that supports our work and our funding for transportation infrastructure that supports infill. That policy is to support mixed use, infill, and transit-oriented developments that utilize system capacity, reduce vehicle miles of travel, and improve air quality through improved rail mobility and access management. We thought it would be helpful to introduce a definition of infill for purposes of this discussion. Broadly speaking, infill development is really just the process of developing vacant or underused parcels within already developed surrounding urban areas. And really it can occur in several varieties and scales. You can have parcels that were previously undeveloped and are developing for the first time. Parcels that were redeveloped, usually at a higher intensity, such as smaller sites in existing downtowns, and they can be all the way up to much larger sites of former developments, such as shopping mall sites or areas that have had brownfield remediation. Or types that we might think about less commonly as existing developed parcels that are more filled in, such as commercial buildings being added to an existing shopping center or accessory dwelling units added to single family home sites. So they're not even necessarily new sites, they're just filling in existing sites. Some of the transportation impacts of infill can include the ability to use existing transportation capacity when infill occurs near existing transit and when it's using existing infrastructure instead of building new infrastructure, which can be a major cost savings. Infill frequently results in a higher intensity of land uses. And in those cases, we can have a greater density of trip destinations, and that can result in the opportunity for shorter and fewer and or more multimodal trips. Excuse me. And then in North Texas, infill occurs at a variety of scales, of course, from small lot to big developments. There's not really any limit to any boundary where that can occur, but it can meet transportation objectives of optimizing the use of existing system capacity, increasing destination density, and then increasing the opportunity for non-motorized travel. So that's just a quick introduction to the topic, and we will now move on to our guest speakers. There. Okay, our first speaker is Tina Fergan. She's the Director of Planning for City of Farmers Branch, and she will be discussing their station area code and activities that have been going on in downtown Farmers Branch. So take it away, Tina.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate the introduction. So I'm excited to share the work that we've been doing in Farmers Branch. I feel like I've been part of this for about the past 20 years, even though I've worked in a couple of the cities in between. I'm on my second tour of duty with the City of Farmers Branch, if you will. But I'm excited to share with you some of the visioning and regulatory framework that we established early on, but then also more importantly, some of the projects that we're working on today and how they're coming to fruition. I believe you'll find that some of the project examples that I have for you and our regulatory framework are consistent with DART's transit-oriented development goals for their stations that Jack spoke to earlier. So hopefully you'll find some commonalities there. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar with Farmers Branch, we are your traditional first ring suburb on the north side of Dallas. We're right there on the north side of 635, if you will. Our eastern boundary is the Dallas North Tollway. Our westernmost boundary now touches on the super connector of President George Bush Turnpike. We have roughly 49,000 residents, depending upon which source you ask. This one's from the Census Bureau, and we employ quite a few people within our community as well. I like to think that you can get to Farmers Branch just from about anywhere that you're coming from in the DFW area. We have excellent access from our neighboring regional highways. We're also conveniently located to Love Field and DFW Airport. But more importantly, and especially for this discussion today, we have a stop on DART's Green Line within our community. And the opportunity of having a DART station, especially when I think back to some of the initial work that we've done in our community, has really been the impetus behind our downtown that we're trying to create today, or sometimes we refer to it as our station area. But we knew having that DART station was going to be potentially extremely significant for our community, hence why we worked on establishing a vision near our DART station. Next slide. So nearly 20 years ago, we established a vision for our station area in July of 2002. Our goal was to have a dense urban village focus on pedestrian and transit-oriented development principles. We were interested in having increased densities of development. We were looking forward to maximizing development opportunities and helping property owners be able to do that. We were also very much interested in increasing property values for our community as well. We wanted to have that improved pedestrian experience, really converting our streets into something more than they are today, having a sustainable mix of land uses that could be complementary and support each other, but also provide for some needs within our community. not to mention having those quality open spaces as well. But we were also interested in how do we maximize access to a variety of different transportation methods. Obviously, at that time, the first and foremost and priority was the DART light rail station, but also looking over the last 20 years, the work that we've done from a regional standpoint with our hike and bike trail system as well. So, and you'll find these first few slides, I'm going to go through kind of quickly just to help set the framework, but because I'd like to really focus on the project. So next slide, please. So the plan on the left, that illustrates the concept plan, if you will, that we adopted in 2002 and illustrates many of the goals and objectives that I just spoke to that the city was wanting to achieve. We were definitely committed to the area, and so we embarked on several initiatives. The first one being we established our station area code for the area back in 2005. It is truly a form-based zoning code. I'd like to think we were cutting edge at the time when we put that in place. And because we were one of the few cities in the area that had a truly or a true version of a form-based code. The other thing that we were doing around that same time is we were beginning land assemblage of properties. If you've been in the DFW area for quite some time, you might have remembered the former Word of Faith property that sat there right on Stemmons Freeway. That is now where our present day Dallas Star Center is located. But we knew having the pursuing land assemblage, if you will, was key in being able to potentially enter into any public-private partnerships and be able to help assist developers in developing within our community. And the station area, or excuse me, the Star Center is a great example of that. And then also some of the existing development with Western Securities today. Next slide. And of course, around the time that soon after we adopted that station area code, then the economic downturn happens in 2008 and 2009, like many experienced. So I think that had ourselves, as well as other communities, looking at their long range plans and looking to see if they needed to make any modifications to their plans. And for us, it was unfortunately having to modify our vision slightly for our station area. So in 2012, we acknowledged that single story development could potentially have a role in our station area along I35. And as a planner, that just pains me to say, but take into consideration the context of the situation and time period of which we were working within. We also acknowledge that surface parking could potentially have a role as well. We did allow for some single family homes just west of City Hall due to developer interest. And I must say, these modifications to our vision were the result of a market study that was also completed around that time to really determine, okay, what could we truly support in the area to help jumpstart our station area. But overall, I think one of the overarching philosophies is that our interest was still strong in having buildings define the street as illustrated in this plan, but having that improved pedestrian experience, the mix of land uses and the like. And so it really helps to provide for our station area code today. Next slide. So I'd like to think our stationary code is for the most part still fairly much intact when we started out in 2005, because again, we're trying to facilitate that lively mix of uses that are complementary with each other, having that urban form of development. In 2012, as I said earlier, we had the wherewithal or we watered down our code, if you will, to allow for single story development, recognizing that that might be necessary. We had minimum building heights of 4 stories and lowering it from down to 1 to 3, depending upon where you're located. We at least preserved the taller building heights closer to the station area. But one of the areas most recently where we felt like we were exposed on our form-based zoning code is that we did not establish any minimum densities for residential uses. So last year we went ahead and established that for multifamily and single family attached development because we felt like we were really exposed potentially from that standpoint. But overall, I would like to say our stationary code is consistent with the vision that we established early on back in 2002. Next slide. And that's really important. I think these images here illustrate our stationary code at work. So it's while we may have had to water down our code in some areas to some respects, you can see just with the images that are shown here, the development that's taken place. Some of the multifamily development was a public-private partnership, but the townhome development that is in the upper center and upper right-hand photograph, that's all private development, and the city did not have a role from a financial perspective on that. The image on the lower right-hand of the essentially 2-story building, that is something that's recently been constructed within our community as part of our restaurant park. Next slide. And so that building is located, as I mentioned, within the restaurant park. We're marketing it as the Shops at Mustang Station. I like that graphic, if you will, that's in the upper right-hand corner because it's beginning to illustrate the various parts coming together with the initial phase of multifamily that was done, and then also the newer development with Western Securities in our restaurant park area. we've been very fortunate that with that development that we've had, it's allowed us to bring these businesses to our community. Some are still trying to open, and that's a result of the pandemic. I think back to March of 2020, Cox Farms Market is our grocery store located within our station area. They opened right when the pandemic was hitting the mainland, and they were probably the only grocery store probably within a 20-mile region, if you will, of them that probably only had toilet paper at that time, given the context that we were working with. But we've been fortunate to have Starwood Cafe open this year. We've had Cedar Creek Eatery and Brew Pub, hopefully will be opening by the end of this month, and with the other restaurants coming online. And having those restaurants there, I think, will be significant for our community, but also help bring traffic to be able to assist Cox Farms Market. So Cox Farms, they've truly been a trooper in all of this, especially weathering the pandemic. And then also we were able to use some of our CARES funding to assist the restaurants in being able to open. Next slide. So, with the images that I just shared with you, I think you can really see our station area code is beginning to achieve our urban village vision that we had established. It has provided the regulatory framework that has facilitated these projects being constructed within our community. I think more importantly, though, one of the key things of the code is it reduces the number of travel lanes within the station area, and that's important, is help provide some of the framework as we've moved forward with some future projects. So next slide. And lastly, in terms of the visioning effort, I will say back in February 2020, we did go back to our city council just to get reaffirmation from them. Do we stay the course and continue working towards developing that dense urban village and continuing those initial objectives with having increased development densities, maximizing our development opportunities, having that mix of uses and the like, having all of those characteristics that are going to facilitate our urban village. And the great thing is they said yes and to stay the course. And with that, that's really provided the foundation for future projects for our community moving forward, as well as some of the projects we're working on today. Next slide. So the first project I'd like to share with you that's of significance for our community is Valley View Lane being reimagined, if you will. I know some folks might call it a road diet. We have some folks here at the city that kind of take issue with that term. So I'd like to think we're reimagining the street for its future, right? So Valley View Lane, major 6-lane divided arterial roadway that traverses through our community. It intersects with I35 and is just located immediately north of our DART station, if you've ever been to Farmers Branch. But the council's reaffirmation of the vision really has allowed us to move forward with this project so that we can improve walkability along a key street within our community. It's also allowing us to be able to repurpose outer lanes for on-street parking, provide wider sidewalks, be able to have some street trees and really reimagine this street much more than what it is today. This project would not be feasible if it was not for the North Central Texas Council of Governments providing us funding assistance, combined with our motivated city council to see this project come to fruition. Next slide. Thank you, Sean. So I love this image because obviously it's the SketchUp model that really shows and what it potentially could be coming to reality. But this image, again, is looking at Valley View Lane just being reimagined and repurposed, converting those outer lanes. You can see the DART train in the foreground, the restaurant park development right behind the DART train there. But it shows what the area potentially has the opportunity to be able to become. And this has also been developed in tandem with taking into consideration the existing regulatory framework that's there. Next slide. So as I said, the opportunity for Valley View Lane being reimagined was really the framework and the basis was there within the existing form-based zoning code that we had in place, because the image on the right is directly out of the code and shows us taking those outer lanes and repurposing them and accommodating for the on-street parking. And then it also gives us the opportunity to try and amenitize the area behind the curb, if you will. But most importantly, I think the fact that the code framework was already established, it helped give our council the opportunity to say yes to this project. Next slide. So another project that we're working on that's significant for our community is our hike and bike trail network, and in particular, our West Side Trail. This trail system is on the western portion of our community, so west of I-35, and it extends all the way over to our western boundary, which is where the super connector for President George Bush Turnpike comes into play. But the trail system, if you will connect from the Campion Trail in Irving on the far west side of our city limits, and then eventually it will connect to our DART station. The trail portions that are shown in green, that has all been constructed by private development. We have Centurion American doing some residential development within our community, but we've also had some commercial development that has been willing to build portions of our hike and bike trail to assist us in that effort. We, the city, obviously are working on all the remaining trail sections. And so what I'd like to do, though, is for purposes of our discussion this afternoon is bring your attention to the area around our Farmers Branch station, which is illustrated in the area where the circle is on the east side of the graphic. Next slide. So our sustainability and public health team is working hard on getting trail improvements built within our community. And one of the projects that they're working on is what I call Denton Drive Repurposed. And so what we're doing is we're basically repurposing the outermost northbound lane of Denton Drive as a cycle track. Next slide, please. So these cycle track improvements will allow us to facilitate right now a current 4-lane undivided roadway. We'll take it down to basically 3 lanes for automotive traffic, but the outermost northbound lane will be converted to the cycle track. And we will, the significance of this cycle track system is really important because of the fact that it will connect eventually to the city of Dallas's future cycle track that they are working on constructing and will be bringing up to our southern city limit line. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, it connects to part of our West Side Art Trail and in the Campion Trail. But then also north of our station area, we anticipate having a shared use trail coming off of that cycle track, if you will, and extending north to our northern city limit line, which will eventually connect with the city of Carrollton. And when they are able to bring their future hike and bike trail system down the south along Denton Drive. But again, this is another example where the zoning was in place that provided the basis for allowing us to drop the lane, if you will, on Denton Drive, and really gave the council the ability to say yes on this project as well. Next slide. So another project that we've been working on is I35 corridor, and we call this the I35 Betterment. So the phase 2 widening of I35 is getting ready to begin from from 635 on our southern city limits all the way up to the Denton County line. In 2009, the decision was made to widen the highway to the west, which has significant implications for properties that are on the west side of our highway. Valwood Parkway and Valley View Lane are 2 intersections that intersect with the I-35 and are significant for our community because they serve as the gateway entrances, if you will, into Farmers Branch. We knew that it was important for us to work with TxDOT as it relates to approving the parents of the highway infrastructure. If you've driven I-35, particularly through Farmers Branch, you'll realize that it's not the most glamorous looking infrastructure. So we realized that we needed to work with them to help utilize the betterments that they are providing, but also any additional betterments that we may be interested in having. And one of the important things that we also recognize is that we had to address the intersection designs at Valwood Parkway and at Valley View. So we recognize that we had one shot to get this right because we know that TxDOT will probably not touch this corridor again for probably another 30 years. And so hence why the mayor established his I-35 Betterments Task Force. This task force worked towards prioritizing what the important items were for the corridor. We all wanted to have all the overhead utility put underground, but we realized that that was very cost prohibitive. And so we agreed that we could be more impactful and have better opportunities for our community by focusing on those 2 intersections and how we can make those intersections create better east-west connectivity within our community. So our goal is, again, improving that east-west connectivity, not necessarily from a vehicular standpoint, but we were really focused on pedestrians, bicycles, and then the cars and trucks in that particular order. We were also interested in improving the overall safety and aesthetics of the intersections in the corridor, but then also improving access between the DART station and our employment and our residential properties. Also significant for our station area is TxDOT agreed to provide an exit for Valley View Lane, particularly if you were coming off of 635 from points west of Farmers Branch. So that was significant for us. And then also simultaneously with all of this other projects going on, we were working on a land use visioning study for the I-35 corridor. And based upon the feedback we were receiving, the indications were that we would be expanding our station area to the west. So the other aspect I'll add, or the other component I'll address related to this and improving that east-west connectivity is with our I-35 corridor study that we had happening, the public engagement results from the study strongly supported improving the east-west connectivity, both from a pedestrian and bicycle needs standpoint, in addition to facilitating expanding the station area westward. Next slide. So the images that are illustrated here, the one on the left that says original layout. So this was the traditional typical intersection design layout that TxDOT proposed for Valley View Lane as well as for Valwood Parkway. The scary thing about the image, if you will, from our perspective, is that pedestrians, the walkway area would be from the back of curb on Valley View Lane and the bridge vent columns. and maybe 6 feet in width to accommodate those pedestrians walking through there. And we realized that that was not very inviting, as well as, given all the other challenges working with from just an aesthetic standpoint and lighting. But in tandem, or in working with our friends over at Kimley Horn, they helped us come up with this concept that we're calling our enhanced layout, which is the graphic on the right. And in working with them, we took the typical Texas U-turns and skewed them, if you will, by 4 degrees. As a result of doing that, that allowed us to push the pedestrians between the bridge bent columns and back of curb on the U-turns, if you will, and then allowed us to come up with an area that ranges anywhere from roughly 22 feet to 45 feet in width to be able to accommodate the pedestrians and the bicyclists. The other thing, in working with TxDOT, they said yes to this. We're very fortunate for that. They were also willing to allow us to narrow the travel lanes, if you will, because their original concepts were 12-foot wide lanes. For Bellwood Parkway, we had a 14-foot wide lane even creeping in there. And so we realized that we needed to shorten up that distance that pedestrians need to walk. So thank goodness TxDOT said yes, and at least allowed us to get all of those lanes down to 11 feet in width. Next slide. And then this graphic just helps better illustrate what we're trying to achieve from an aesthetic standpoint. But you can see with the U-turn lanes being skewed, it really provided opportunities for us to improve for the pedestrians and bicyclists that would be traversing under the I-35 bridge. Next slide. And of course, this image really tells it better with the SketchUp modeling that we did. We've had to break down the betterments into phases, but like I said, our primary focus was getting the intersection layout done correctly. We figured if we could get the base in place, then that allows us to add to all the pretty stuff later, right? The decorative lighting, the art features on the columns as well. Farmers Branch, we're known for our trees, so hence why you find the trees and the leaves a lot of in our branding that we do for the community. But I love this graphic on the upper portion, because you'll see in the upper right-hand graphic that the pedestrian area and bicycle area has really widened and improved for pedestrians compared to the distance between the back of curb of Valley View Lane and the bridge bent columns. Next slide. And lastly, on betterments, again, thank you to TxDOT, because they were willing to allow us to push the envelope, if you will, with our abutment wall graphics, and they will be paying for the costs associated with the abutment wall graphics at both intersections. So we're very grateful for that. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the key objectives that we've been doing all this time has been land assemblage. And right now we own 10 acres of land that is essentially, for the most part, all undeveloped. That has allowed us to be able to enter into negotiations with an experienced pedestrian and transit-oriented developer to be able to enter into a public-private partnership for our station area. As I mentioned, we're currently in negotiations with them. And it's fun when we're having these conversations. They're like, well, can we do multifamily? We're like, yep, the zoning's already in place, allows for it. Well, we'd like to put the streets on a diet and repurpose these outer lanes. Can we do that? We're like, absolutely, yes, the code already allows for it. The fact that we have our station area code already in place saves the developer time and money, because it's already entitled and they're not having to go through that process. Additionally, it allows us to be able to have our expectations already established in working with them. And so they at least know what the target is. We have some relief valves built in the code that would allow for some alterations or some variations, if you will. But for the most part, it at least has the framework in place that allows us to be able to say, this is what we want. Next slide. And just briefly, I'll touch on this. As I mentioned earlier, we were working on an I-35 corridor vision study. This was more of a land use study, but also looking at some transportation improvements as well, looking at how do we better position the I-35 corridor for the next 20 years and create additional value within the corridor. We were very fortunate. Our council was supportive of this project and they adopted it. They adopted the corridor study, if you will, in February of 2021. Some key transit elements that come out of this study are, again, redesigning Valley View Lane as part of as a new front door street, if you will, within the area. This particular pertains to Valley View Lane west of I-35, given the work that we're already underway with design for Valley View Lane east of I-35. But again, other elements of the study from a transit standpoint are focused on designing for walkability, improving the sidewalks, implementing the bicycle connections, focusing on that last mile connectivity. And then also we've been working with COG on their Irving to Frisco passenger rail, which is also a 20-year plan, if you will. And we provided for increased densities that in the event that that rail line eventually has passenger commuter rail happening on it, that we've positioned our station area to be able to support that rail station there in that location as well. Next slide. So one of the things that the team asked us to address was lessons learned related to our project. So I feel like we have the traditional planning story, right? Of you establish a vision, then you develop your implementation plan and you execute your implementation plan to have your achieved results. In our case, we established a vision that allows us to tell the story. And I think that's truly something that can be applied in other communities. If you determine what you want, then you may not have the funding in place just yet to be able to execute all the implementation items, but at least allows you to tell your story to developers when they come knocking, as well as the property owners who own land within your community. Developers are going to be more interested in pursuing projects that are going to be supported by the city, right? Because they're wanting to have, they're not wanting to have an uphill battle. Hopefully they want to be lock, stock, and barrel with city staff. But if you do not plan your cities, then as many of you are probably aware of, the developers will plan your city for you. So in our case, we felt like it was really important to have that vision in place and allowed us to be able to tell our story. In our case, we've been able to work on implementing our vision. And I would tell you, use the tools that you have available and be proactive. You know, in our case, we established the zoning back in 2005. We were active in our land assemblage. That has provided for some of the existing multifamily development that exists today, as shown in this picture here. In the partnerships we've done with Western Securities, same with the buildings that are now in place in the restaurant park. We also put a TIF district in place around the time that we established the zoning code, because we knew that that was a tool available to be able to fund some of the public infrastructure improvements that we would want to be able to do. We executed public-private partnerships. And to me, I think if there's a lesson learned on this, it's always be sure you choose the right development partner, right? You want someone who's experienced in doing this type of projects that you're interested in having. You obviously don't want the first developer the developer who's coming in first, cutting their teeth for the first time on this type of project in your community. So that's something that's been very important for us and continues to this day, given the fact that we're in negotiations with someone to be able to develop our 10 acres of land within our station area. We also have bonds. Our community adopted or approved a bond, if you will, to allow for some of the public improvements that eventually we will be making within the corridor or the station area. But then also just the funding from other agencies. In particular, I mentioned earlier, thank you to COG, because they're willing to be able to help us finance our Valley View Lane being reimagined in our Denton Drive repurposed project. The other lesson I would share with you, in our case, at least it worked very well for us, is that having that existing zoning in place really provided the foundation. It gave the council the ability to say yes. It also gave them the ability to have some political coverage, if you will, because of the fact that the zoning was already in place for that area. We've been very fortunate to have a very supportive city council, as well as planning and zoning commission too, that really understand what we're trying to achieve in our station area. Next slide. And you know, when I think, and speaking of our elected and appointed officials, when I think about the first time I worked in Farmers Branch, when we were putting the visioning in the zoning code in place, like I said, I had about an 11-year gap and went and worked in a couple other communities and had the opportunity to come back, but I still feel like we're still doing this to this day. You know, early on, we were having to educate our elected and appointed officials to help them understand what we were trying to achieve. And we still continue to this day to educate our elected and appointed officials, because let's face it, you have turnover, right? Especially if you have term limits like we do. So you have council members and planning and zoning commission members that are coming and going. So from time to time, you have to remember to educate the new folks that are participating now to let them understand what the bigger picture is. We've been very fortunate that we've had elected and appointed officials that really get it in terms of what we're trying to achieve. And also when we take that time and do the education, then they kind of like have that aha moment, right? And they understand why we're doing the actions that we're doing. I would also say find your project champions. In our case right now, we're very blessed with the council that we have because like I said, they get it. They understand what we're trying to achieve. The fact that we're doing the Valley View Lane, Denton Drive projects is very significant for a community of our size within the DFW area. The other thing I would tell you is stay committed to the vision, reaffirm, reevaluate, retool when necessary. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we had to do this coming out of the 08-09 economic recession. Update your code because you'll find that there are certain things that work and that don't work. We continue to make tweaks here and there, and we will likely make a few more as we go along. The other thing I will tell you is also, you know, if you do establish your zoning code, don't forget to defend the code and be sure, you know, be sure to help educate and let folks know where your code is working. You know, say, well, do you like how this building turned out and how it is in relationship to the street, or these elements here that we included? And they're going, oh yeah, that turned out really, really nice. Well, that's an opportunity for you to defend your code and be able to share, you know, this is how our code is working. I feel like I'm doing this on a regular basis. I'm happy to go back and educate people and tweaking it here and there where we find that we need to. But I have to continue to help them understand where the code is working, because especially with our elected officials, sometimes they only hear from folks when it's not working or if something's not working to their advantage. So hence why I always say, remember the good and trying to be able to illustrate that. And then lastly, I would say, don't give up. I know elected and appointed officials can change, staff members can obviously change, but I would say continue, stay to be committed, educate where you can, and point out all the good that has occurred along the way as you work on your project. So I really appreciate you allowing me the opportunity to share the work that we're doing in Farmers Branch and the projects that we're pursuing, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tina. Exciting things going on in Farmers Branch. Appreciate it. If anyone has a burning question, we can take about a minute. If you want to ask a question of Tina, otherwise we ask that you drop it in the chat or we'll address those at the end.
I'd like to just add one thing that Tina didn't mention, which I think is integral to the success here, is that unlike any other of the DART cities, Farmers Branch demanded that DART would not grade separate the tracks over Valley View. And that in fact, Valley View was going to be necked down to 4 lanes instead of 6 lanes with parking on the side. And they came up with that back in the 90s and they stuck with it. And there was no changing their mind when, most times the first thing every city wants to do is, well, we're going to bridge over, aren't we? We can't, you can't slow down those cars. Your cars are number one. So I think, to me, the context would not be the same if there was that grade separation over Valley View. You'd have that split. So I think that's a great compliment to what Farmers Branch did. And now we're starting to see other cities do that, where they're necking down some of the streets and crossing at grade.
Thank you, Jack. And I must say, I can't take credit for that. I may have been just a senior planner at the time, but my bosses that were in place and in our leadership at the time, I think, especially Michael Spicer, who's now in Richardson, was probably really pushed for that. And obviously it's paid dividends for us today and has allowed us now to move forward with reimagining, if you will, Valley View Lane and being able to make it eventually a 4-lane divided roadway.
Great, thanks for adding that history, Jack. I think we're going to move on now to our second speaker. 2 speakers from the city of Flower Mound. We've got JP Walton, who's interim director of economic development, and John Chapman, long range planner. They're going to be talking about their Lakeside DFW project.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you all for having us. We're just going to go right into it. We're going to talk about Lakeside DFW today, and it is in the town of Flower Mound. So next slide. We're already introduced, but we're going to tag team this presentation today. I'm JP Walton, assistant to the town manager and the interim economic development director. And we also have John Chapman, who is our long range planner. Next slide. So to get our bearings together here, this is Lakeside DFW. It's on the southern portion of the town of Flower Mound. Town of Flower Mound is fairly wide. We actually go all the way out to I35W, but this is in our southern portion of town. To the west of Lakeside DFW is, of course, Grapevine Lake. It abuts up to the lake, so you can get those nice sunset views. And then to the east of Lakeside DFW, we have our Lakeside business district. So you're going to have a lot of your warehouse distribution, flex space, and also office. In fact, Realty Capital, who developed Lakeside DFW, has also opened up Class A office space at the end of 2020, right there on FM 2499. So as you can tell on the left picture, Lakeside DFW is about halfway built out. That northern half has been developed. The southern half, which is called Lakeside Village, is actually under construction right now. It's a very successful mixed-use development here in town. It actually has a very vibrant community, a very successful business community so far. And we also wanted to point out that We do at the southern portion of the developed area, we do have Lakeside Tower, which is a 16-story condo tower overlooking the lake. So we'll go on to the next slide and I will pass it off to John.
Thanks, JP. I'm John Chapman. I'm the current long-range planner. So we're going to start off just with the foundation of what we all know is in planning, the zoning and our future land use designation. Both our mixed use regulations along with our master plan were adopted in 2008. And this area was identified on our master plan for mixed use as well as adopted zoning for mixed use as well. Both the master plan and the mixed use zoning district do identify several functionalities related to today's discussion, such as integrated street networks shared by vehicles, cyclists, and pedestrians, connectivity to our existing town transportation networks and surrounding neighborhoods, walkability within the development itself, and interconnected public spaces such as parks, open spaces, and water features. The future land use does have, sorry about that. Our zoning does also include from our mixed use ordinance, it requires 2 out of 3 transitional zones, as well as the core mixed use zoning. I'm sorry, next slide. There it is. As I was saying, it does require 2 of our 3 transition zonings, as well as the core mixed use district. Lakeside DFW did adopt all 3 of those, being a neighborhood transition, the major roadway transition, and the environmental transition. These each serve as a buffer between the regularly zoned areas between our town and our core mixed use district. Next slide, please. Just a brief history. It's about 20 years or so in the making. It began back in 2000 with a 380 incentive agreement that required the town to install infrastructures in hopes to spur development. However, due to economic downfalls around that time period, it was shelved. The project was shelved, but however, picked back up in around 2006 when our council formed a steering committee that was charged with developing the strategy to facilitate mixed use developments within the town. That steering committee then led to a mixed use ordinance that was adopted by council in 2008 with recommendations from the committee itself, as well as town staff. 4 years later, Lakeside DFW was re-entitled within the 149 acres. The zoning entitlements were approved, as well as the DA, the development agreement. 2 years following that, in 2014, another Chapter 380 incentive agreement was created to waive all town development fees and created a tax rebate program and required a deceleration lane, all of which we will chat about later. And then in 2014 and 2015, there were 2 additional development agreement amendments, which addressed the development issues related to wastewater and amended amenity requirements. And then between 2018 and 2020, phase 2 had been entitled with concept plans and development agreement amendments as well. Next slide, please. For today's discussion, one of the larger items that came out of this development was the Lakeside Parkway improvement. The original 380 agreement in 2020 required the town to install what you see on the bottom of the slide, which was a 3-lane parkway with 12-foot drive lanes, a 20-foot planting strip, and 14-foot sidewalks. The town then, through the updated mixed use or the creation of the mixed use zoning ordinance and master plan, recommended that on-street parking be included with the updated street section, as well as a more narrow drive lanes and a little bit smaller planting strip, all in the efforts of encouraging more efficient parking. Next slide. On the left, you'll see the red line. That is the basically the portion of Lakeside Parkway up to this point that has been updated with the existing street section that's been approved by town council. And the two green dots illustrate the roundabouts that have also been updated through existing amended site plans for those areas. Next slide, please. This development does have a large trail system. The gray hashed line is our required 8-foot trail. It's just nearly 2.5 miles of pavement. It connects 17 public and entitled open spaces, which is great, and activates a lot of the area and provides residents abilities to kind of get away from the high intensity uses that are within this development. Along the boulevard, which was the Lakeside Parkway, we are required to have 14-foot sidewalks. Those sidewalks are provided for bicycle pedestrians, sidewalk amenities, all those sorts of things. And then the trail system that runs between, it's going to be that first picture and the second picture. That trail system, it interconnects many of our multifamily buildings for easy access, and it leads to a looped path that's developed as part of the Long Prairie Park. One cool feature that I myself do find really awesome, just being able to walk around this development, is our observation park, which overlooks Grapevine Lake. As well as entitled amenities within that same area, such as our amphitheater. Around the entire development itself, within all the right-of-ways, we do require 5-foot sidewalks. So as part of the 8-foot trail system along all right-of-ways on both sides, if it's not part of the 8-foot trail system or a 14-foot sidewalk within the boulevard, it's going to have at least a 5-foot sidewalk. And I'll pass it back over to JP.
All right, and I'll touch on some of the incentives and talk about development agreements that we've had at Lakeside DFW. So our Chapter 380 agreement really had three main parts. First off was a tax abatement for 50% tax abatement for 10 years. Then we had an impact fee grant, which really is a cash grant equal to a specific amount or percent of impact fees paid. And so it was 100% cash grant for the first 2 years, 87.5% for years 3 and 4, and 75% years 5 through 10. On our permit fees, we actually waived all permit fees for the first 2 years, reduced to 75% for years 3 and 4, and then reduced 50% years 5 through 10. And essentially that just tried to incentivize that area to develop quickly. As we all know, the sooner that area develops, the sooner that the town can get, some of the ad valorem tax from it. And so when we do our incentive agreements, we actually go back and we grade them or keep a scorecard. We just want to keep track. We do this annually every single year. So for this particular incentive, every $1 that the town spent on this incentive, we actually receive $3.50 back in our return. And this does not include sales tax, which of course the state of Texas doesn't allow us to, that's confidential information, so we can't release sales tax information. So it's much larger than that. Also through our development agreements, we established escrows for both infrastructure and amenities. We also had timelines for those. We required 4 mixed use buildings at the entrance of the development. So I'm gonna take a little moment to talk about this. So yes, when we say that, is we required those commercial units on the bottom floor to stay commercial. So I'm sure a lot of y'all have developers coming in, and we all know that, I know it spoke about earlier, we can't really force a market. A lot of them are gonna need that critical mass in residential before they're comfortable with that retail there. So what we did on this particular project is those front 4 buildings, we required those commercial ready units to be commercial. The rest of the development along Lakeside Parkway, the bottom floor units are commercial ready. And what we've seen is it took a little while at first to get it going, but we really see that those commercial ready units have flipped into actual commercial, and we still have a little bit more to go. But I really think requiring those front four to do that really helped set that in motion. We also have minimum requirements and timelines for infrastructure and amenity completion. Those are all outlined in our DA. And also, this is really for the second half, which is called Lakeside Village. The second half of the development, we made sure to include project phasing requirements that tie residential units to commercial development. And so we actually do that in a lot of our larger developments with a mixture of uses. We'll try to go ahead and try to tie them on phasing requirements. You can only have up to so many residential, and then we're going to need to start seeing some of that commercial come in. Next slide. So we're going to touch on some of the lessons learned here. So pre-existing utilities made connections difficult. Also, the next one's really some of those unintended consequences. Town was required to purchase a new fire truck due to the tower's height. So we don't have a 15-story building here in town. You know, we'll go up to 4 buildings. And so this is something that, you know, maybe in everyone's respective departments, you know, really got to think kind of outside the box, all the unintended consequences that something like this will require. And so also what we've noticed too is our fire department has got a tiller truck, which actually has a steering wheel in the front and the back. And that's for some of these more mixed use developments, a little denser. You're going to have smaller streets, tighter angles. And so this helps them to maneuver through those areas, and also additional training. So basically high tower, fire rescue, et cetera. We had to invest in that for our fire department. Something else that we changed is our park dedication. So we have a pretty robust park dedication, also park development fee here in town. Now what we had is in our mixed use ordinance, which John explained was fairly recently created, we allowed for 200 feet, basically required for multifamily units in a mixed use development that they have to have 200 feet of private open space. We started researching that, and we felt like that wasn't a lot of the mixed use ordinances that we had researched. However, we wanted, you know, a little bit more. We thought that we also wanted to kind of turn our parks department around a little bit and think about some of these really nice urban type open spaces. So your courtyards, for example, they're going to be smaller, but they're going to be highly amenitized. And so we wanted to find a way that we can give credit for that, keep it privately maintained so the town doesn't have to really pay for upkeep on the life of that. And we also want them publicly accessible. And so we created an entire new park credit option that's really focused on more of these denser mixed use areas. We also, another lesson that we learned is requiring dedicated parking for public recreational spaces. So as John had mentioned, there's a lot of really great trails here. There's that sunset point that he showed, and it actually hooks on to the Army Corps of Engineers trails along Lake Grapevine. You can go all the way on the north side of it. And, you know, so that's one of our lessons is we really need to start creating areas where people can park in order to access those trails. And lastly, require developer to conduct third-party inspection. So actually a part of our mixed use ordinance is it requires a third party during the actual mixed use ordinance preparation during that time. But we also noticed that we could use that on inspections. And I think this goes back to the tower again. We don't have a 16-story building here in town, and it would have been helpful to have that third-party inspection as well. So we are going to, I think that wraps us up, unless John, you have a couple more to add.
We were just gonna, next slide, just quickly touch on kind of what's next for this development. As JP had mentioned, a lot of the south side of this development is currently going through grading and some site plan amendments. So that is in the works. So the remaining part of Lakeside Parkway will get some improvements with some on-site parking or on-street parking, as well as the third roundabout will receive one additional spoke as well as some minor modifications. Aside from
There's going
that,
to be, so as I said, there's going to be some additional residential towers down there, another boutique hotel. They're planning on around 5 to 6 restaurants, kind of on the inn overlooking the lake down there, and also some more Class A office buildings. So I just wanted to add that. And there will also be more of those kind of mixed use buildings where you have retail on the bottom, residence on top. So I just want to add that, John.
yeah, thank you, JP. So yeah, it's an exciting project. There's been multiple staff members throughout the past 20 years that have had a hand in this. And I think anyone can look onto this project right now and be proud of the work that's been put into it.
All right, thank you, JP and John. It's a really interesting project. Again, we have time, like a minute. If there's any burning questions or comments right now, otherwise you can jump onto the chat and we'll have time at the end as well. All right, I think then we'll move on to our final speaker, who will be Matt Hoffman. He's with Miller Boskus Black Architects, and he has worked with the city of Bryan, Texas, in implementing a new zoning technique that promotes infill development. So I'm going to pass it on to you, Matt.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate it. And Lindsay Hackett from the city was going to join me. Unfortunately, she can't be here today, so I'll sort of do my best to cover things from her perspective if that comes up. Yeah, so we were hired back in 2018 to do an area plan for about 2 square miles on the Midtown area, which, if you're familiar with Bryan, runs between downtown Bryan to the north and Texas A&M University on the south. It's literally Midtown. Several different aspects to that plan, zoning, catalytic projects, public infrastructure improvements. We did quite a bit. But as Sean mentioned, one of the more novel techniques that we came up with was this idea of pattern zoning that we're going to talk about today. Next slide, please. So we have, after working with several small and medium-sized towns across the country, we've developed an approach that's really based on incremental development. If you're not familiar with this, you can sort of think of this as something that in some ways is an alternative to some of the more capital intensive models that we've talked about today, which tend to, as we've seen, rely on property aggregation and tax abatement and other sort of subsidies. This is something that can work along with those sorts of planning techniques, or even instead of those sorts of planning techniques. And really what we're trying to do is make small possible and make a lot of small projects possible. And we do that by, and I do mean this literally, by giving neighbors the tools that they need to actually participate in the growth of their own neighborhoods. That's what we're trying to do. And of course, in addition to the reasons you're looking at on your screen here, I won't read them to you, but I think we're all familiar with some of the historic parts of our towns. They tend to be some of the most beloved places in our towns. And of course, they were built incrementally. They were built on a parcel by parcel basis by small and medium scale investors. So that's the kind of thing that we want to make possible again. Next slide, please. A lot of you may be familiar with the term missing middle housing. That's a term that describes development models and building typologies that take place somewhere in between small scale single family houses on one end and sort of the large mega apartment projects on the other end. In terms of why that middle is missing, I think this diagram sort of starts to explain it. We see in most towns that we work in, most towns are really focused on what's allowed. They have these really robust zoning codes that go into a great amount of detail regarding each and every aspect of the development that is allowed, and all of the different development models that are allowed. And of course, oftentimes, especially in towns that have a form-based zoning code, those missing middle projects are allowed, and sometimes they're even marketable. And sometimes towns, as we've seen in this panel discussion already, sometimes towns that are really sophisticated will put in the extra effort to figure out what is marketable, which obviously developers are interested in. But what we found is that actually the only projects that get built are the ones that are both allowed, marketable, but also convenient. And sometimes there's not a lot of intentionality about exactly where that bullseye lies within our code. But one thing we do know for sure is that developers will find it. They will find the most convenient thing that's both allowed and marketable. And more often than not, that tends to be, as I mentioned, the really large scale apartment projects or the single family houses on the other end, and really not much in between. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we developed this novel tool for we prototyped in Bryan. We're now also deploying it in several other cities, sort of regionally, continuing to refine it. But basically, this is a voluntary program. I want to emphasize that it's a voluntary program that is sort of equal parts economic development incentive and zoning tool. What we're doing is we're actually designing small and medium scale infill projects, and we're pre-approving them on a parcel by parcel basis within the study area. So in this case, it was Midtown Bryan. And when I say designing, I don't mean, we just sort of drew a picture of the facade and said, hey, you can build something that looks like this. I mean that, we're an architecture firm in addition to a planning firm. We actually went through and developed complete sets of construction documents for a series of buildings that are pre-approved for construction on any number of these parcels. And we did this at a number of different scales. You're seeing the 4 different pictures here, existing projects in the city of Bryan. A ton of work went into this. We did a really lengthy architectural survey of the area, trying to figure out sort of the most beloved buildings, but also the most needed buildings. We did a visual preference survey to try to suss out which direction we needed to go architecturally. Next slide. And what came out of that is 4 flexible building types that we wanted to pre-approve. And so we have sort of on the small end, a cottage, and on the larger end, a larger mixed use walk-up building that can also be all residential. All of these are flexible. They're available in a number of different formats, because one of the questions we always get about this is, okay, you're only doing 4 building types, isn't everything just going to look the same? So do 1, 2 slides forward. There we go. So what we ended up developing in the pattern book is this kind of architectural choose your own adventure, where you can think of the basic building type of, either a cottage or an apartment house or a walk-up building as being sort of like a chassis that we can then apply different architectural treatments to, different facades, different unit types, 1 or 2 bedrooms, even different configurations. So, flex house can go back and forth between a single family house and a duplex. And the idea was to try to provide as much flexibility as we could within the program, but we know that there's going to be a need for more. So next slide. Part of the program was also to develop a set of guidelines for the city that would allow minor modifications to that the city could approve administratively that would still keep the building within a sort of qualifying territory for being pre-approved. And then, of course, major modifications would simply kick the project out into the normal development review stream that every other project, since the beginning of zoning has been able to go through. That's still available. Next slide. Okay, so I spoke about incremental development, and I want to show a little bit how this could play out. This is a little diagram that we threw together. You can think of this as kind of a typical midtown neighborhood, and actually it's just sort of a typical suburban neighborhood. You can see sort of suburban single family development model, large lot single family houses at about 3 units per acre. You see this kind of commercial arterial that cuts through the middle of it with large swaths of surface parking out front. Next slide. I spoke about, there are many aspects of this project. One was a pretty intense study that we did along this commercial arterial that went through the study area, and we ended up recommending several different catalytic projects along the corridor, where we actually worked with property owners and developers to try to suss out their vision, but also recommended some public improvements along the way to the public right of way. So we see that as sort of a near-term intervention that could help catalyze some of the other types of development that we want to see in the area. Next slide. So this is kind of a 5-year vision, and what you're seeing is, some of the little blue buildings. That's the cottage building type that we've pre-approved. That's an incredibly flexible building type, as they all are, really. The cottage is one that can either be put in the backyard as an accessory dwelling unit. It can be put on a small parcel all on its own, or it can be aggregated and used in a larger parcel to create like a bungalow court or a cottage court. And as you can tell, just looking at the diagram, we're 5 years down the road. We've already doubled the density. And just by looking at those streets, you can tell we haven't torn anything down. All of them are going to be pretty familiar to what they were, just a few years ago. And of course, that's a great way to keep from, angering the neighbors. Next slide. So another 5 years down the road, we've doubled the density again. Again, the streets are relatively familiar, and we're starting to see larger building types. We're starting to earn our way up to some of the larger building types, those 3-story mixed-use walk-ups that we've pre-approved along the corridor. On some of the larger parcels within the neighborhood, we're seeing, some of the aggregated development typologies like the bungalow court. And next slide. And then we sort of have the climax condition here, 15 years down the road, where we've actually earned our way to one of those large scale developments. So you see the purple large mixed use building on the corner. That's not something that we would need to pre-approve. That's something that would come along after those retailers have seen the natural development of all the rooftops that they need in order to justify that kind of development. But again, the neighborhood is still quite familiar to what it used to be. That familiarity principle plays out all the way through. And here we are 15 years later, and we find ourselves at really a transit-ready density of 18 units per acre. Next slide. So just to jump into the actual deliverable a little bit, this is an excerpt spread from the pattern book, which we were really fortunate to be recognized by the Congress for the New Urbanism at their awards ceremony last year. This is it's pretty straightforward. I mentioned it's kind of a choose your own adventure. You can see this is the spread for the cottage. You can see all the different architectural iterations, all the different floor plan iterations. And even though we weren't required to go with any sort of fair housing style or ADA issues, especially on the small end, we made sure to include fully accessible plans, even for smaller building types, where we could make the ground level fully accessible as an option. So people have called these Lego buildings. It's there's so many different ways to sort of mix and match them. Next slide. There we go. So along with every building type, we did a series of lot diagrams and supplemental criteria that are really based on typical lots within Midtown. And when I say typical, I mean, it's a rectangle. It sort of complies with the general lot dimensions. So the average lot dimensions that we see in Midtown through our study. Obviously, if you've got a 3-sided lot with a creek running through it, this program may not work for you. But for the vast majority of lots in Midtown, we're going to have a diagram that works for it. You're seeing the one again for the cottage all the way on the left. You can see how we've got a plan for a small scale, a small lot infill. You could also put it, as I mentioned, behind an existing home as an accessory dwelling unit, or as you can see in the 2 diagrams on the right, those kind of small bungalow court formats. And we've developed this set of supplemental criteria that's described both in the diagrams here and in an appendix that sort of acts as a set of development standards. And it deals with everything from, the required number of parking spots to the required number of street trees to, the required width of drive aisles and even cross access in areas where we didn't have alleys. So it's a pretty comprehensive document that is insular. It works all on its own. It's something that people can opt into, and if they choose to opt into it, they can actually get a building permit in 7 to 10 days. And as I mentioned, they can actually get a complete builder set to go ahead and build the building while they're at it. Next slide. Here's just a kind of a sample of the different building types that we created for the city of Bryan. The cottage that we've been talking about is all the way up at the top. You're looking at kind of a cottage court arrangement there with, I think, 3 different cottages, 1 and 2 story mixed in. The second one down from that with the shed dormer, that's actually a triplex, which surprises some people. Obviously, it looks like a single family house. And one of the real strengths of this program, we did several different public meetings. We had hundreds of people come to public meetings, and we actually printed out, we did 3D prints of all of these building types so that we could hand them out to people and they could turn them around and look at them and ask questions. And we found that sort of empirically, if you ask someone, hey, what do you think about putting a triplex in your neighborhood, in your single family neighborhood, most people are going to be like, not only no, but heck no, get out of here. But if you hand them a model of a building that looks like that, a pretty significant percentage of them are going to say, hey, actually that's pretty nice. That looks like a nice development. And there's, how many units did you say? There's 3 units. So, people are really surprised by the ability of design to bridge some of these gaps that we often see in these development conversations where it's, the big development against the big neighborhood. So I think pattern zoning is a tool that can start to bridge that divide and bring people together around the conversation of good, competent, civic art, civic design. And we think, again, that these missing middle housing types are a great format to have that conversation in, if you can do the work to get them pre-approved and make them actually the most convenient development model that is available in the city. Moving forward, let's see, there's the third one down, that's the flex house that I mentioned. So that's the duplex that can flex between being a duplex or a single family house with just a little 4-digit renovation. You just have to either tear out a door or put in a wall, one of the two. And then the last one on the bottom, that's the real transformer building. You're seeing a 2-story mixed use walk up there. That can also be a 3-story mixed use walk up, or it can be a 2 or 3-story residential building. It can have 1 or 2 bedroom units in it. And we're able to do that with, with wood frame construction, conventional framing, no elevator needed, a single stair. So from a development perspective, also it's a really attractive model. And I wish Lindsay were here, she could speak to this, but I think that one's getting quite a bit of interest from the development community in Bryan. Next slide. I mentioned, pattern zoning is still in some ways it's at the prototype stage. We're where form-based coding was maybe 20 or 30 years ago. Obviously, there's hundreds of form-based codes in the country right now. I'll call it 1.5 pattern zones because there's one in Bryan and we're working on the second one in Claremore, Oklahoma. So as we start working with new cities, we have a few more in the pipeline, we're finding a lot of opportunities to sort of translate the program in a way that will solve local issues. So one of the things that's exciting about the Oklahoma pattern zone that we've been able to do is actually bring in a lot more building types, a lot more choices. We also did something we call a quick start pattern zone, where we came in with a lot of building types on the front end that we didn't have to do a planning process for because they were already by right buildings in the city. We just brought in better versions of them, basically sort of human forward front porch single family houses instead of the typical snout house. And another unique aspect of that plan is that we're actually able to partner with a developer early on in the planning process, and they're actually going to be starting construction on some of the pattern buildings even before we finish the entire plan with all the bells and whistles, all the walk-ups and everything else. So as I mentioned, this was going to be the point at which Lindsay sort of did a deep dive into the City of Bryan end of it, and I'm happy to do the best I can to answer questions about that. But hopefully that's a good enough overview for everyone, Sean, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Matt. That was very interesting. I think it'll be really interesting to see how this plays out over time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm going to, we have about, let's see, 15 minutes left for questions, overall questions on all the presentations, including Matt's. So I'm going to hand it over to Travis to start off that discussion.
Thanks, Sean. I'd encourage everyone with their time remaining to submit questions in the chat for our speakers, or feel free to unmute yourself and jump into the conversation. I know we have many expert planners and experienced folks from around our region on this call this afternoon. So we'd love to hear your questions from your experience with infill development in the region. But to start us off, I just wanted to ask, how important, in each of these projects and planning processes was sort of the economic rationale of seeing an economic benefit from either allowing small infill or larger infill? And have you seen any of that so far? Why don't we start with Tina?
I think the economic rationale actually did factor into our decisions, because at the end of the day, we were interested in maximizing development opportunities and creating increased property value within our community. So there's obviously a definite economic value there, and that is of importance to us as we continue to move forward with the development partnerships that we're looking at entering into with respect to the 10 acres of land that we have right now. But as we continue conversations, I know Jack spoke earlier to, I think the statistic that he had was something like $16 billion worth of development near the transit stations within the DART network. We're a small component of that, right? So the economic development factor really did at least influence us in our decision making.
I guess I'll go on to say as well, here in Flower Mound, we're about, when you look at kind of our property taxes, 75% residential, 25% commercial, we've had kind of a push. Guess you would define us as a bedroom community. A lot of people live here, may work somewhere else. So we've had a push to try to balance that out more. I think that when you talk to, I think office is something that we would really like, corporate office. I know that 2020 has definitely put a dent in that market, but we have seen office move out to some more of really our suburban type communities. But when you talk to folks who do want to bring office in, they need people, they also need a variety of housing types. They need more of these mixed use developments and more of denser areas. And so we definitely have seen this Lakeside DFW as an example be kind of that first step into attracting more corporate office, which is what we're looking for.
Hey, this is Eric Wilhite. I just wanted to mention, I know back in the day when we were early on in North Virginia Hills doing expanding hometown and such with the mixed use stuff, and especially the vertical mixed use, have you guys noticed, it seems that developers have an easier time getting financing now? Because I know early on, as this stuff moved into this region, developers wanted to kind of do it, but they had a difficult time getting the financing because the banks and insurance companies and all the other people involved in that kind of aspect of it didn't understand it. And they had a hard time getting financing. So I think now it seems that it's, the point of the spear is kind of past now, and it's getting more creative on new ideologies with it, but the financing is probably not as difficult to get as it used to be.
I guess for us in Farmers Branch, I would like to think, at least from the multifamily side of things, that developers have not necessarily had a difficult time getting their financing, given the number of multifamily projects that we have happening within our community. We have been very supportive of allowing multifamily development so much that now our council is beginning to ask the question of, have we allowed too much, right? So we have noticed that some projects haven't come to fruition just yet. And we also, we were in discussions with another developer at one point in time who was looking for all kinds of city incentives, claiming that they need that to be able to help offset some of their costs. And so we're no longer visiting with them right now as it relates to our land. But so that's, I mean, that's kind of what we're seeing in Farmers Branch.
And I like to just ask the group, as I work on some projects that are mixed use and such, in different communities, when you say multifamily, it kind of instantly starts to seize people up. So I think
I live in one of those communities.
yeah, I know you do. And so, I mean, do you all find it helpful when you're describing some of this mixed use or different types of things to call it urban residential, or, you know, I sometimes try to call it higher density residential, but even the word density or higher density kind of freaks people out. But I think, like you were talking earlier, that on the pattern codes, that people think, oh no, threeplex, no way. And then you show them the architecture and the form and they kind of relax back. And I had to do that, you know, a couple of times, where you show examples of a, you know, something that's 12 units per acre compared to 18 units per acre, and ask them which one they like. And they'll pick the one that's 18 units per acre, not knowing density is, just because the form is a whole lot better.
Yeah, you bring up another important topic too, which is, you know, the words we use matter quite a bit. I don't even want to think about how many meetings and sort of wood shop sessions we had just talking about, you know, what are we going to call these? What are we going to call these patterns? You know, we can't call the walk up a 12plex. You know, we can't call the triplex a triplex. So, you know, it became apartment house, and it became midtown walk up, and it became flex house, you know, for the flexible duplex, and it became cottage for the accessory dwelling unit. So I think it's also possible to get sort of too cute with that. I don't think you want to, you know, you don't want to just turn them into you know, caricatures of themselves. I think you want to be honest with people, but if you can back up good messaging also with good design, then I think everybody should be able to feel great and honest about where they're at with what they're proposing in their communities. And I saw a question as well. I got the line here from Joe in the chat about units being investor owned or owner occupied. And, you know, I think it's a mixture, certainly with a model like the flex house, where you've got the ability to flex between single family and two family. You know, there's an obvious correlation there to, you know, maybe a young family who's looking for something that they can grow into, but might need the extra income from a second unit in the meantime. Or also at the other end of the spectrum, you know, a couple who's looking to age in place and might need a larger house for the time being, but is willing to downsize into a ground floor master apartment with either a caretaker's unit above or a you know, extra income unit above. And, you know, I just want to say that it wasn't accidental that we arrived at those sorts of determinations about what building types were going to be most appropriate in the area. We actually did a market study to determine, you know, demographically, what are we trying to deal with? And it turned out it was those young families and those empty nesters. So a lot of what we did was informed by a great deal of study, and we tried to build that into the architecture.
Great. Thanks for that input on the topic. I wanted to ask, do we have any other questions? Anyone else want to jump in and ask a question? We have a few more minutes. All right. Well, one of the other questions I had that I wanted to talk here about is with what's been built so far, at least in a couple of our examples, do you notice more people walking, biking, using transit? Have these infill developments really create that opportunity? Any anecdotal or demonstrated evidence you guys have noticed?
I was gonna say in Farmers Branch, yes, I've noticed more pedestrians, especially near City Hall. And we're kind of unique in that, in some respects, our City Hall is within walking distance of the DART station. And so between our building and we sit in a park also, if you will. So we have a lot of residents that just live west of City Hall, which the multifamily and the single family homes that have been constructed are essentially conveniently located next to the DART station. But I've noticed many more people at least walking in the area using the amenities. We do have folks that show up every now and then from time to time to our planning and zoning commission meetings on some projects that we've had that complain about the fact that our sidewalks are not more accessible and walkable. So I guess that's a good problem to have, right? And people not liking your sidewalks, because then it helps give support to projects like Valley View Lane being reimagined, because we are trying to improve the walkability aspect. So, so that tells me that folks are out walking.
And in terms of Lakeside DFW, I go down there pretty frequent for lunch. I went down there even yesterday, and it's not uncommon to see people on bicycles, especially around lunchtime, coming out from their apartments, townhomes, working from home and utilizing the restaurants that they have available to them. There is a tiny marketplace there, nothing that would be similar to, and I apologize, Tina, if I botch this, Cox's Market. Nothing that would be similar to that. It's much more, just maybe a little bit bigger than a convenience store marketplace. So that would be probably something in the planner's realm that is missing from that area to really help facilitate individuals, be able to eat, play, and work there. But other than that, yeah, it's pretty busy down there, especially right as you get 12 o'clock. It's just like a mass of people coming downstairs, finding food, getting a break from just sitting inside their apartments. So the parks are utilized pretty frequently. When I was out taking photos last week, there were people out walking their dogs, bicycling, sitting on the benches in various parks. I know a lot of people go down to the area near Grapevine Lake and picnic out there and have dinner, especially around the sunset, just because of the views. So
I was gonna say, if I could add one thing, as I mentioned earlier, we were working on the I35 Betterments projects with respect to our intersection designs and with respect to people walking. So we have some limited service hotels that are located on the west side of I35. And I've seen frequently folks coming from the east, walking under those horrible conditions under the existing bridge at I35, and notice that they're carrying plastic bags and they're grocery bags, right? They've walked over to Cox Farms, but so when I see them make the trek through the very uninviting pedestrian world it exists today, it gives me hope for our work that we're doing with TxDOT, because I want to tell those folks, I want to roll down the window and tell them, hey, it's going to be better. Just give me about 5 years, right? So, but because we got to get through the highway reconstruction. But it's interesting to notice where folks are walking to or coming from, and with the other land uses that we have in the area.
I think some of those examples you give of seeing the real world actions and behaviors of people helps to facilitate the discussion of, beginning to get the funding and the planning to do complete streets and reimagine some of the suburban streetscapes and areas, because people are actually already using it in a, less than inviting way, and seeing a lot more momentum on municipalities trying to not only create their downtowns to be more inclusive and complete streets, but just other connectivity type situations and streetscapes. Just a matter of getting public works and fire department people on board to understand that they got to share the right of way, and so much limited right of way. Of course, the width is heavily utilized for sure.
Mm-hmm.
All very good points on the transportation context that support infill development and are needed. So Tina, I really appreciate you giving that example of the municipality practically working with TxDOT. And I Want to let everyone know we're going to post the slides on our website, nctcog.org/LUTTF for the Land Use Transportation Task Force. So feel free to grab that example and share with your community if you think it would be helpful. And Tina, if you want to make yourself available to talk with folks, I think that would be great as well too. So we can all learn together, as that is the purpose of these conversations like this. So we're at 4 o'clock, and I want to thank everyone for joining us, joining the task force conversation on infill and transportation. Again, we'll make this material available on our website. So I really appreciate everyone taking time out of their day to join the conversation. And thank you, especially to our speakers for providing this content. And before I close it out, Sean, is there anything we have forgot to mention?
I don't think so. I think we're good.
Great, great. Well, everyone, hope to see you again in July for our next task force meeting. Until then, take care and thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Travis. Thanks, Sean. Good stuff.
Thank you.